Isaac Grayson stood outside the dimly lit entrance of his own upscale restaurant, adjusting the fake glasses on his nose. The place had his name on the paperwork, but he hadn't stepped foot inside in over a year. 13 locations, a corporate team handling day-to-day operations. He had trusted the system. But lately, something felt off. Online reviews hinted at rude staff, food quality slipping, and a toxic kitchen environment. He had inherited the company from his father, who had built it from a single bistro into a thriving chain. Isaac had done well expanding it, but now he wondered if he'd lost touch with what made it special. That's why he was here, dressed as a new dishwasher named Ian, ready to see the truth for himself. The general manager, a stocky man named Greg, barely glanced at him when he walked in. "You the new guy?" Isaac nodded. "Dish pit's back there." Greg jerked a thumb toward the kitchen. "Stay out of the way, don't slow down the line. No introductions. No welcome. Just orders." Isaac swallowed his irritation and walked toward the back. The kitchen was a controlled chaos of sizzling pans, shouting cooks, and the rhythmic chopping of knives. The smell of garlic and butter filled the air, but the tension in the room was thicker than the aroma. He noticed a young woman scrubbing dishes furiously, her face tight with concentration. "Hey, you Ian?" she asked, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. "Yeah. I'm Naomi," she said, offering a quick smile. "It's rough back here, but I'll help you out." Isaac got to work, rolling up his sleeves and plunging his hands into the soapy water. Within minutes, his arms ached from scrubbing, and the heat from the dish machine made sweat bead on his forehead. He wasn't expecting an easy night, but he hadn't realized just how relentless this job was. A loud voice cut through the noise. "Move faster, Naomi. You're slower than my grandma, and she's dead." Isaac turned to see two chefs leaning against the prep table, smirking. One was a tall man with a sharp jawline, the other a stocky guy with a deep scowl. Naomi kept her head down, scrubbing harder. "Maybe if you weren't such a screw-up, we wouldn't be drowning in dishes," the taller chef added. Isaac froze, gripping the edge of the sink. He had expected to see some inefficiencies, maybe a bit of disorganization, but this? Public humiliation? He glanced at Naomi, whose hands trembled as she worked. "Hey man, that's not necessary," Isaac said, keeping his voice level. The stocky chef scoffed. "You knew? Then shut up and do your job." Isaac clenched his jaw. He wasn't just some new guy. He was their boss. And this? This was unacceptable. Isaac forced himself to stay calm. His instinct was to shut everything down right there, but he needed to see more. If these chefs were comfortable enough to humiliate an employee in front of a new hire, how bad did things get when no one was watching? Naomi kept her head down, moving even faster now, her hands darting through the soapy water like she was trying to outrun their words. Isaac could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she swallowed hard before answering orders. The two chefs, meanwhile, had already turned their attention back to the line, shouting at the servers who were picking up plates. Greg, the manager, strolled through the kitchen, glancing around but saying nothing. He didn't correct the behavior. He didn't even seem to notice it. Either he was blind to what was happening, or worse, he didn't care. Isaac kept working, listening. The kitchen ran on a brutal rhythm, and he quickly realized the issues went beyond just the way people were treated. The plating station was a mess, tickets were piling up faster than they could be filled, and the food leaving the pass was inconsistent. He caught one of the line cooks scraping a burnt sauce off a steak and drowning it in fresh garnish to hide the mistake. A server hesitated before grabbing the plate. "Is this okay to send out?" she asked. The taller chef rolled his eyes. "If they complain, we'll just remake it. Most of them won't notice." Isaac's stomach twisted. So this was the standard now? Send out subpar food and gamble that no one would call them on it? That wasn't how his father had built this business. That wasn't the reputation they were supposed to have. Then came the moment that nearly broke his restraint. A waiter brought back a plate barely touched. "Table 7 says the fish is undercooked." The stocky chef yanked the dish away, glaring at the untouched fillet. "These people don't know what the hell they're talking about." He grabbed the fish, tossed it back onto the pan for a few seconds, then slid it back onto the plate. "There. Tell them it's fine now." Isaac's hands curled into fists. That was a health risk. That could make someone sick. The server hesitated, then sighed and took the plate back out. Isaac turned to Naomi. "Does this happen a lot?" She hesitated, glancing at the two chefs before answering in a low voice. "All the time. If customers send something back, they just reheat it and hope no one notices." "Greg doesn't do anything about it?" She let out a bitter laugh. Greg? He's barely around. And when he is, he only cares about cutting costs. He tells them to make it work no matter what. Isaac's pulse pounded. He had been worried about customer complaints and employee morale, but this was worse than he imagined. This wasn't just bad service, it was outright negligence. And it was happening under his name. A loud clatter snapped his attention back to the dish pit. Naomi had dropped a plate. The ceramic shattered at her feet. The taller chef groaned. Unbelievable. You can't even wash dishes right? Naomi bent quickly, picking up the shards with shaking hands. Leave it. The chef's voice was sharp. You'll probably cut yourself and then cry about it. Isaac had seen enough. His cover be damned. He was done watching this happen. He straightened, wiping his hands on a towel. His voice came out steady but firm. That's enough. The chef turned, narrowing his eyes. What? You heard me. That's enough. The kitchen went silent. Even Greg, who had been lazily scrolling through his phone near the walk-in fridge, looked up. The stocky chef folded his arms. Who do you think you are, talking like that? Isaac pulled the glasses off his face. I'm Isaac Grayson. I own this place. For a moment, no one moved. The air in the kitchen shifted. The chef stiffened. Greg's mouth fell open slightly before he quickly shut it. Naomi's eyes widened. The taller chef's confidence faltered, but he forced a laugh. No way. You're messing with us. Isaac stepped forward, his gaze locked on him. Do I look like I'm joking? The chef's face paled. Greg cleared his throat, stepping forward. Mr. Grayson, Isaac held up a hand, silencing him. His attention stayed on the two chefs. I've been here for hours. Long enough to see what's really going on in my kitchen. The way you treat your coworkers, the shortcuts you take with food, the complete lack of respect for customers, it's unacceptable. The stocky chef shifted uncomfortably. We were just... No, Isaac interrupted. No excuses. I watched you humiliate an employee for no reason. I watched you knowingly send out bad food. And Greg, you let all of this happen on your watch. Greg swallowed hard. I didn't know. That's the problem. You should have known. You should have cared enough to stop it. No one spoke. The weight of his words settled over the kitchen. Isaac turned to Naomi. How long have you worked here? 8 months, she said quietly. And no one's ever done anything about this? She shook her head. Isaac exhaled slowly, then looked at Greg. You're fired. Greg's face went red. Wait, you can't just... Yes, I can. And I am. Greg opened his mouth, then closed it again, realizing there was no argument to be made. He turned sharply and stormed toward the back office. Isaac turned back to the chefs. As for you two, you're done. Get out. The taller chef clenched his jaw. Just like that. Just like that. For a moment, they hesitated, like they were waiting for him to change his mind. When he didn't, they tossed their aprons on the counter and walked out without another word. Isaac let the silence hang for a moment before turning to the rest of the kitchen staff. Their eyes were wide, uncertain. This place used to stand for something, he said. And it will again. Things are going to change starting now. He met Naomi's eyes. There was something there now that hadn't been before. A flicker of hope. And for the first time in a long time, Isaac felt like he was finally doing right by his father's legacy. The kitchen remained eerily silent as Isaac stood at the center of it all, his words still hanging in the air. The tension had shifted from hostility to something else, uncertainty, maybe even a flicker of relief. The two chefs were gone, Greg had disappeared into the office to gather his things, and now the rest of the staff stood in a loose circle around the dish pit, waiting to see what would happen next. Isaac exhaled, steadying himself. He had acted on instinct, but now he needed to take control of the situation fully. This restaurant, his father's legacy, had been left to rot under leadership that only cared about cutting corners. That ended today. He turned to the remaining kitchen staff, scanning their faces. Some looked uneasy, others surprised. A few, like Naomi, had an expression he couldn't quite place, something between exhaustion and cautious optimism. He gestured toward the prep station where plates waited under heat lamps. Who's in charge of the line now? A younger man, probably in his early 20s, hesitated before stepping forward. His chef's coat had stains from hours of work, and the way he carried himself suggested he was used to keeping his head down. That'd be me, I guess, he said. I'm Luis. I mostly handle grill, but when those two weren't around, I took over. Isaac nodded. How long have you been here? Almost 2 years. And you've seen what's been happening? The insults, the food being sent out like that. Luis's jaw tightened. Yeah. Isaac took a step closer. Why didn't you say anything? Luis hesitated, shifting his weight. Because people who spoke up didn't last long. Greg backed those guys no matter what. If you complained, you either got your hours cut or you just weren't on the schedule the next week. Isaac glanced at the rest of the staff. A few of them nodded subtly, confirming what Luis had said. That explained a lot. The toxic leadership hadn't just been about bad behavior, it had been enforced through intimidation. Employees didn't speak up because they feared losing their jobs. Isaac folded his arms. That ends now. No one here is going to lose their job for calling out problems. If something isn't right, I want to know about it. A murmur rippled through the kitchen. Luis studied him for a moment, then took a breath. If you mean that, there's more you should know. Isaac nodded for him to continue. Luis wiped his hands on his apron before speaking. Greg wasn't just ignoring the way those guys treated people. He was involved in some shady stuff himself. We ran out of fresh seafood last week, and instead of ordering more, he told us to defrost some stuff from the freezer that was supposed to be trashed. Said to make it work. Isaac's stomach tightened. Serving expired food was a legal and ethical nightmare. If customers got sick, the entire restaurant's reputation could collapse. He turned to Naomi. Did you know about this? She hesitated before nodding. I overheard him telling one of the servers to just sell it as is and hope nobody noticed. Isaac inhaled sharply. He had already fired Greg, but now he regretted not dragging him out of the building himself. He glanced back at Luis. Anything else? Luis exchanged a look with Naomi, then nodded. The tips. Isaac frowned. What about them? Greg was skimming. The servers were supposed to get a cut from the tip pool, but every week it seemed like less and less was actually being paid out. A few of them asked about it, but he just told them they must have miscalculated. Isaac clenched his jaw. Stealing from employees. Serving expired food. Protecting abusive staff. It wasn't just negligence. Greg had been actively exploiting the people who worked here. Isaac turned toward the door to the office, where Greg had disappeared. Stay here, he said to the staff. Then he strode across the kitchen, pushing the door open without knocking. Greg was at the desk, stuffing papers into a bag. He looked up, startled. Isaac's voice was cold. You've been stealing from the tip pool. Greg's face twitched. That's not true. Don't lie to me. I know what you've been doing. And not just the tips. Expired food, intimidation, all of it. Greg stood up straight, trying to recover. Look, I was just trying to keep costs down. It's not like anyone got hurt. Isaac took a step forward. You don't get to decide what corners to cut when it comes to people's health and wages. You're lucky I don't press charges. Greg's confidence wavered. You're leaving now, and don't think about setting foot in any of my restaurants again. Greg hesitated, looking like he might argue. But then he slung his bag over his shoulder and pushed past Isaac without another word. Isaac followed him back into the kitchen, watching as Greg headed for the exit. The second the door swung shut behind him, the tension in the room eased. He turned back to the staff. Starting today, things change. No more abuse. No more stolen wages. No more cutting corners on food quality. If you're willing to stick around, I'll make sure this place is something to be proud of again. Luis was the first to nod. Then Naomi. Then, one by one, the rest of the staff followed. It wasn't just about firing the bad actors. It was about rebuilding something better. And Isaac was ready to make it happen. Isaac stood in the center of the kitchen, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The toxic leadership was gone, but that didn't mean the restaurant would automatically right itself. There was still work to be done, and he had no intention of walking away this time. He turned to Naomi and Luis, the two employees who had shown resilience despite the conditions they'd been working under. The rest of the staff looked at him with cautious curiosity, waiting to see what kind of owner he was going to be now that the chaos had been addressed. The sound of the dining room beyond the kitchen was a reminder that customers were still expecting their meals. Whatever changes had to happen, they needed to start now without disrupting service. Isaac gestured toward the line. Luis straightened his posture, seeming to understand the unspoken request. He stepped up, glancing at the remaining cooks. The hesitation in his expression was brief, but Isaac caught it. Leadership had been dictated by intimidation here for too long, and stepping into a role that had previously been ruled by fear wasn't going to be easy. Isaac addressed the team. His voice was steady, but not harsh. We're still running a restaurant. Orders need to go out, but we're doing this the right way from now on. Luis, you're in charge of the line tonight. If you need something, ask for it. If something isn't right, fix it before it leaves the kitchen. Luis nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. He turned to the rest of the cooks. All right, let's reset. If anything's been sitting too long, remake it. We do this clean. A few of the cooks glanced at each other before nodding. No one argued. Isaac moved back to the dish pit, helping Naomi clear the backlog. She worked quickly, but there was a difference in her movements, now less tension, less fear of being singled out. As she handed him a clean pan to dry, she finally spoke. I didn't think anybody would ever do anything about it. Isaac didn't look up right away. He placed the pan on the rack before answering. Neither did I. That's the problem. She didn't push for more, just nodded and kept working. The kitchen began to settle into a more natural rhythm. Without the shouting and insults, the energy shifted. It wasn't perfect, there were still adjustments to be made, but it was already an improvement from the toxic environment he'd walked into earlier. As the night went on, Isaac took notes, both mental and physical, on what needed to change. He saw where efficiency was being lost, where training had been neglected. He noticed that some of the equipment was outdated, making the cooks' jobs harder than necessary. At one point, a server came back with a dish that had been sent out incorrectly. Instead of getting defensive, Luis immediately called for a remake. The other cooks followed his lead without hesitation. It was the kind of accountability that had been missing before. Isaac continued working alongside the staff until the last ticket had been served, making sure every plate that left the kitchen was something he could stand behind. Once the rush died down, he stepped back, wiping his hands. The exhaustion in his muscles was different from what he was used to, the kind that came from physical work rather than corporate meetings. The staff gathered near the prep station, waiting. There was an unspoken question in the air. What happens now? Isaac exhaled before speaking. This is just the start. Tomorrow we go over wages. I want to make sure everyone is being paid what they're owed, including any money Greg took from the tip pool. If you're missing anything, you're getting it back. A few employees exchanged surprised glances. He continued, we're also bringing in proper training. No more figuring things out on your own or being thrown into chaos. Everyone deserves to know how to do their job well. And if you want to move up, there's going to be a real path for that. Naomi shifted slightly, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe it. Isaac caught the doubt in her expression. I know words don't mean much until you see the changes. But I'm not going anywhere. This is my place and I let it get away from me. That won't happen again. Luis crossed his arms, considering him. And what about the next manager? How do we know they won't be like Greg? Isaac nodded, understanding the concern. Whoever takes over will be someone who actually respects the people working here. And I won't just be checking in from a distance anymore. I'll be here, regularly. If something's wrong, I want to hear about it. The staff absorbed his words. Some looked relieved, others skeptical. But no one protested. Isaac glanced at the clock. It was late and they were all exhausted. He let out a breath. All right, go home. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start fresh. The employees slowly began gathering their things, filtering out of the kitchen. A few murmured to each other, the atmosphere lighter than before. Naomi lingered near the sink, drying her hands. Isaac met her gaze. You thinking about leaving? She hesitated. I don't know. I've been looking for something else. I didn't think this place would ever change. He didn't try to convince her. Instead, he simply said, give it a week. If it's not better, I won't blame you for moving on. She studied him for a moment before nodding. All right. A week. Isaac watched as she grabbed her bag and headed toward the exit. As the last of the staff left, he remained in the empty kitchen, taking in the quiet. It wasn't fixed yet. There was a long road ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Isaac returned to the restaurant early the next morning, stepping inside just as the first light of dawn filtered through the front windows. The dining area was empty, the air still carrying the faint scent of last night's service. The quiet was a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the kitchen only hours ago. He wasn't here to observe anymore, he was here to rebuild. The first employee to arrive was Luis. He walked in through the back entrance, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His expression was wary but focused. He gave Isaac a small nod, then headed straight for the line, checking the supplies before anyone else arrived. A few minutes later, Naomi walked in, her posture tense, as if she were still deciding whether staying was worth it. She spotted Isaac near the prep station, hesitating before approaching. She stopped a few feet away, her arms crossed. She told him she was giving it a week. Isaac nodded, understanding the unspoken challenge. He had no intention of wasting the opportunity to prove that things were truly changing. More staff trickled in, some still groggy from the early hour, others watching him with curiosity. They weren't used to seeing the owner in the kitchen, especially not before the day had even begun. Isaac gathered them near the prep station. He laid out the immediate changes. Wages would be reviewed today, back pay for any stolen tips would be issued by the week's end, and a new kitchen manager would be hired based on merit, not favoritism. Training would be implemented, not as an afterthought but as a structured program to ensure every employee had the resources they needed to succeed. Luis asked what would happen in the meantime with no executive chef to oversee the kitchen. Isaac told him they would run the kitchen together until the right leader was found. There would be no interim replacement who might carry over bad habits. They would rebuild the foundation first. The staff absorbed the information, some still skeptical but most relieved. Once the discussion ended, everyone moved to their stations. The early prep work began as ingredients were pulled from storage, knives hit cutting boards, and the hum of burners filled the space. The kitchen felt different not just because of who was missing, but because of the shift in energy. Isaac worked alongside them, helping wherever needed. He assisted at the prep station, ensuring that nothing was wasted. He checked the inventory himself, noting what was running low so they could place proper orders. Midway through the morning, a server named Jenna approached him with a concerned look. She mentioned that Greg had always handled the scheduling, and with him gone, no one knew who was covering shifts for the week. Isaac realized this was yet another piece of mismanagement he had overlooked. He asked Luis and Naomi to help him sort through the schedule, making sure no one was overworked or placed in impossible shifts. They adjusted the rotations, ensuring the strongest cooks were covering peak hours while allowing newer staff the opportunity to grow without being thrown into the deep end. Naomi commented that it was the first time anyone had asked for input on scheduling. Isaac stored that information away. By midday, deliveries arrived, and Isaac noticed something concerning some of the produce was subpar, bruised, or nearing expiration. He asked who was responsible for receiving orders, and an older cook named Raymond admitted that Greg often approved shipments without checking quality, likely to cut costs or pocket supplier incentives. Isaac made a note to renegotiate vendor contracts. As the day progressed, Isaac saw something he hadn't in a long time: employees who weren't just working, but taking pride in their roles. With no fear of being berated, the younger cooks began asking questions, eager to refine their techniques. The servers moved through the kitchen with more confidence, no longer afraid of being dismissed or ridiculed. Luis, though still adjusting to his temporary leadership role, stepped up in ways Isaac hadn't expected. He corrected plating issues without condescension, ensured dishes left the pass at the proper temperature, and even helped train one of the newer line cooks on timing. Naomi, meanwhile, worked with a quiet efficiency, still observing more than speaking. But Isaac noticed the tension in her shoulders had lessened, even slightly. As the evening rush neared, Isaac stepped back, watching the kitchen function in real time. It wasn't perfect, there were still small mistakes, moments of hesitation, but it was already a vast improvement from the chaos he had witnessed the night before. By the time the last dinner orders were plated and sent out, the staff began the final cleanup. Isaac helped scrub down the stations, ensuring everything was left in better condition than it had been found. As the night wound down, Luis leaned against the counter, wiping his hands on a towel. He looked at Isaac, his expression unreadable. Then he admitted that, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't dreading coming into work. Isaac held back any immediate response. Instead, he simply told Luis that this was only the beginning. Naomi, passing by, overheard. She didn't say anything, but there was something different in her expression. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it also wasn't doubt. And for now, that was enough.